The topic is about mandatory reporting, mandatory carbon reporting. I'm also going to talk a bit more broadly around carbon measurement and reporting that should be of use for those that are perhaps not captured by the regulation, and also those for who this might be new to. First of all, just to give you a bit of background about the Carbon Trust for those that don't know us. We were originally set up in 2001 by the UK government in response to calls from business to make the climate change levy revenue neutral. We are now an independent, not-for-profit organisation, and we're mission-driven. Our mission is to accelerate the move to a sustainable, low-carbon economy. There are three key areas of the work that we do. The first is advice, and that's advising a whole range of private companies, the public sector, and also governments, particularly governments overseas. So we've been doing lots of work in Mexico, in South Africa, and in Brazil, for example. The other area of our work is footprinting, and that includes both measurement and certification of footprints at a corporate level and at a product footprint or product or service footprint level as well. And also technology. So we do everything from incubation support for new technologies and innovations, innovation programs, right through to supporting the deployment of technology. And so that involves helping businesses to demonstrate a business case for investment, helping to provide information about suppliers through an accreditation program. And also we have a financing program with Siemens Finance to help finance the investment in energy efficiency. Okay, and to start off, I just wanted to get us all at a common ground by what we mean by footprinting. Companies talk about a carbon footprint, often meaning quite different things. So here is a diagram from the GHG protocol. For many companies, footprinting starts with Scope 1 and 2. Those are your core emissions that the business owns or controls. Most companies are already doing something around their operational footprint. It's a good starting point. There are opportunities to better understand the business, to reduce costs, and also access to data in order to be able to get a footprint for this is often much easier. When companies talk about the operational footprint, though, it can be different between different organisations depending how the business is structured. So you may find two companies that produce a similar product, but one outsources the manufacture. As such, the outsourced elements don't form part of the core operations of that business, and it won't be included in their Scope 1 and 2 footprint. So the footprint for those two companies would look quite different. As a result, there's been a move to Scope 3 or value chain reporting. The GHG protocol released a guidance document in October 2011 that sets out 15 different categories of Scope 3 emissions. We've done some work with companies to look at reporting against these different categories. Many of them are very difficult to report against, access to data, etc. And also some are not necessarily relevant to everybody's business. But the idea is that for those two companies I talked about earlier, it's much easier to compare if you can also see outsourced operations. And also looking at areas like business travel that's within an organisation's control, but it doesn't come under their Scope 1 and 2 footprint. Many organisations also report business travel and waste as a typical starting point. The other area to mention, although I won't talk about it very much today, is just product footprinting, and that's looking at the emissions throughout the life cycle of a given product. And many companies will opt to use this approach, particularly where they have a key strategic product, and they need to have information about the emissions resulting from the different life cycle stages. And that could be to inform design of the product. It could also be because there's questions coming from the customers. Maybe not necessarily consumers. You may find, for example, the public sector asks many of their suppliers for information about their services. So having an understanding for a particular service or product of the emissions is very useful for companies. Okay. And so why are companies measuring and managing their footprints? Well, essentially, you need to measure to be able to manage. There are lots of risks associated with carbon emissions. Three areas here, the first being physical. So we read quite often now in the papers about the physical effects of climate change, particularly in areas like agriculture, and better understanding the supply chain emissions and where they originate from can help to better manage those risks. Not understanding them puts your business at continuity risks. There's also obviously costs associated with that. The second is regulation. So actually, often organisations are having to measure and report their footprint. For a while now, we've had different regulatory schemes, the carbon reduction commitment, the EU ETS, and mandatory reporting that I'll come to next in a bit more detail. A whole load of other regulations around different areas of sustainability as well, around specific to buildings, looking at water, looking at waste. And the risks really of not measuring in that respect is that you fail to comply with the requirements. There may be penalties, but also the costs of getting that wrong. And then the third area is markets, and this comes down to the real direct financial impact on your business. So looking at the price that you're paying for inputs to the business. Energy prices we're seeing rising, and also raw materials as they become more scarce, the costs increase. So understanding the scale of those inputs is very important. And also, as I mentioned, demand from customers. They're increasingly willing to switch to find products and services that meet their own criteria. But also, there is lots of stuff that businesses can do. So measuring is the first step, and then taking action with that knowledge is very important. So doing everything to improve the efficiency of resource use, both energy and material inputs and water, and also looking at other sources of energy, for example, low carbon technologies. And then there are opportunities. So better understanding the business, better understanding your emission sources directly can lead to a reduction in costs, but also looking at different ways to satisfy changing markets, changing business objectives. And reputation being a big one as well. There's an increasingly competitive element to measurement and reporting. Okay, so that gives you a feel for some of the why about carbon reporting. Why, from the government's perspective, introducing the mandatory requirement. They have targets around reducing emissions from the UK, and the Climate Change Act required that they brought in mandatory reporting or justified why they weren't going to do that. So they've been under consultation for some time. They recently consulted on the draft regulation, and that's now closed, and we expect a finalised regulation to be released probably the end of this year. So this is now to give you a feel for what that regulation is. The first point is who is this going to affect, and there has been a little bit of unclarity in the media around this point. So it's only going to affect UK incorporated companies and those that are quoted. And by quoted, it's defined under the Companies Act. The LSE main market companies. It also includes companies listed in an EEA state or on NASDAQ as well. and the New York Stock Exchange, sorry. But worth remembering that this is not going to apply to foreign companies, so just UK companies. So many companies that are listed on the LSE won't be captured by this. And what is it that companies are going to have to report? So first of all, thinking about the organisation, companies, there's lots of flexibility in the regulation, so companies can choose what organisational boundary is appropriate to them, but it has to be consistent with the way the financial reports are compiled. The typical options are a control approach, either financial or operational, and an equity share approach. Most companies choose one of the control approaches. The way the legislation is worded at the moment, it suggests the financial control approach to be consistent with the accounts, but that's a point that's, I think, been fed back as part of the consultation, that it maybe doesn't offer enough flexibility for companies and may make it quite difficult. So companies, for example, that would report a joint venture may not have access to sufficient amount of detail of data to be able to report the emissions associated with that venture. It also covers global operations, so although it's just UK companies, if they operate internationally, companies are going to have to look to gather data and to measure the emissions associated with any operations that they have around the world. This is going to be quite a new thing for many companies. Lots of companies have a good hold on their UK data, they have the systems and processes in place, and this is going to be an area that many companies are now looking at for the first time. In terms of the operational boundary, what emissions are you having to report? So DEFRA define the emission sources. They're essentially the Scope 1 and 2 emissions as defined under the GHG protocol. Because Scope 1 and 2 is a definition of the GHG protocol, DEFRA have explained in their own words what that means, but essentially it's stationary and stationary consumption, anything from own transport and fugitive emissions, so air conditioning, refrigeration, gases. And the emissions are going to have to be reported in carbon equivalent. So that's the equivalent of the 6 Kyoto gases. Companies are also going to have to report both an absolute and relative basis. So what is the absolute footprint in that year, but also look at it on a per revenue basis or a per square metre. The actual indicator can differ by different companies, so companies have the flexibility to decide which they use. It'll be different by different sectors, so whichever is most appropriate is fine, but it has to be reported. And then the baseline, so companies will have to report all this in their first year, and then the first year will have to be reported every subsequent year. So many companies have already been reporting, they may already have a baseline which they're measuring their performance against. That is separate. They'll now have to have a baseline for the purposes of mandatory reporting, that is the first year of the regulation. And then an important thing to mention is there's a comply or explain clause, which it's not very well defined. It's almost like a get-out clause, but the purpose of this regulation is to encourage companies to be more transparent. So it's going to be very difficult for companies to just not report. They'll have to explain convincingly why they haven't reported, or if there's elements they haven't. So it may be for some companies that emissions are so immaterial to their business. It may be that some companies are not really intended to be captured by this regulation. So if actually you look at the list of companies on the LSE main market, you'll find there's lots of financial instruments there, so preference shares, for example. It's not a company in the sense that it has to produce an annual report, so they wouldn't report their emissions. Also thinking about the scope, it may be very difficult for some companies to get information about particular areas. So if you haven't yet measured your global emissions, then it may be that you explain that that is not included. But I think you'll have to say that there are steps being put in place in order to get to that stage. So how do companies report? There is no specific guidance or requirements that companies have to follow. It's as I say, very flexible, so companies can choose what to follow. Typically, it will be the GHG protocol for companies that are international, or for companies that are just UK. Then there's the DEFRA guidance as well. Those are the two key guidance documents. Verification has been made optional, so there's not a requirement for companies to use external parties to verify any of the numbers that they're reporting. Highly recommended, though, that companies do have very robust internal audit processes to be comfortable with the numbers that they're publicly reporting. It may also be that companies do choose to go for external verification. The point about where this is going to have to be reported, it's going to appear in the director's report within the financial accounts. And so as such, the board of directors will have to sign this off. So for them to be comfortable with the numbers, they may choose to go down the external verification route. And also worth mentioning, this won't be looked at by financial auditors, although they will have to state that there's nothing within the director's report that's inconsistent with anything else that appears in the report. So they will have to review the report and anything. Anything that is used to back that up, so some sort of audit trail. And then importantly, the timing. So this comes into place next April, and this is another point that's yet to be fully clarified by the regulation. But it appears that if you have a reporting year that's April to March, then you'll begin from your next financial year. If you have a different reporting period, so for example, if you have a calendar year, we think it's unlikely that the government will apply this retrospectively. So you won't actually begin reporting until the 2014 financial year. Okay, and just to mention, this is something that has come up a few times. There's obviously lots of regulation around carbon reporting that already exists, that already affects many of the companies that will be captured by mandatory reporting. So you have this carbon reduction commitment, you have the EU ETS, you have climate change agreements in the UK. Worth noting some of the differences. These are reporting carbon emissions, whereas the new mandatory reporting requirement is carbon equivalent. And these are only looking at the operational emissions from direct sources. So they don't include transport and they don't include fugitive emissions. So the scope is also different. That's going to have lots of implications for companies in the way they set up their systems to be able to report some of the points that previous speaker touched on. Also, just to mention, there is regulation in France, Grenelle 2, that's very similar to the new mandatory reporting requirement, but it's much broader. So that includes lots of indicators that are around environmental sustainability, water, etc., that are obviously not captured here. But I think it gives us an insight into where this regulation might go in the future. So there is within the regulation a statement that the government will have to review it in 2015, 2016. And I think they'll be under pressure to extend it at that point. If you look at the responses to the original consultation, which asked people for their opinions on various different options for mandatory reporting, it offered mandatory reporting for large companies, mandatory reporting for FTSE companies, essentially, and mandatory reporting for companies that used energy over a certain amount, very similar to the CRC. Most of the responses were for large companies, and if you look at the cost-benefit analysis that went along with that, it's quite clear that the lowest cost option was the quoted company option, which is why why the government will have chosen this option, but they'll be under pressure, I think, to extend it. And then they may also extend it beyond the scope 1 and 2 emissions. Just a couple of others there, the CDP and the Carbon Trust Standard. These are both voluntary programs for reporting. Many companies will already be reporting into these, and so will be in quite a good position for mandatory reporting. Okay, I'm running short of time, so I'm going to run through these next few slides quite quickly, but they will be available afterwards. So really just to give you a quick feel for what you need to do in order to prepare for carbon reporting, for both mandatory reporting and any reporting. The first stage is really to think about why you're doing it and what you want to get out at the end. And this is going to affect the numbers that are put together, the way that they're formatted, and the way that they're presented. So just to pick an example here, it may be that you're really interested in looking at cost-saving opportunities within the business, in which case you don't necessarily want a single figure. You want to have a model that can be adjusted and looking at different scenarios. And planning at the very early stages, what you want to get out of the end, at the end is essential before getting started. The next stage then is to define the boundary of your footprint, the scope. So this may be influenced by anything that you have to comply with. The mandatory regulation, for example, sets out what exactly that should include. And then starting looking at data collection, where is it that your data is going to come from? If you don't have it, are there proxy measures that you can use? Who's going to collect that data? And do they have the right skills and capabilities to do that? Are you going to have to outsource any of these elements? And then producing a carbon footprint, a baseline for your first year, and then subsequently you're going to reproduce that every year. And thinking ahead now, one of the other things you want to be planning for is how you're going to communicate your footprint. As I said, it's going to appear within the director's report. It's going to be a narrative. It's not about publishing a table of figures, although there are going to be numbers within there. There has to be messaging around that. So thinking about what your figures mean and thinking a bit more long term about where you're going. So as you come to report in subsequent years, you don't want any surprises. You don't want to be saying that your footprint's gone up unexpectedly. So one of the things that we do recommend is to also think about setting targets. And an approach to doing this is to think about where the business is going, what opportunities there are for reduction. So you may find that you're increasing the number of sites, increasing the number of offices, or becoming more carbon intensive. And what opportunities, as you grow, are there for mitigating that. And then using that to set a target, which may also be influenced by other external factors that you need to consider. So, for example, is there a common target for your sector? And what does that therefore mean for any opportunities? And then thinking about how all of this is communicated and reviewing it every year. It's a very iterative process. So making sure that each year you're re-looking at both the opportunities for reduction, but also the quality and completeness of your data collection, constantly improving that aspect of your footprint. A couple of quick examples of companies that are doing really interesting things around reporting. Coca-Cola, their corporate report won an award earlier this year. They've also certified to the Carbon Trust Standard, which essentially is committing to reductions in their carbon footprint. They've done a lot of work around product footprinting and identified that most of the emission sources are in the packaging. So they're very actively working with consumers to help them to understand what they can do. They found that actually post-consumer recycling can reduce the overall footprint by 60%. And they've done some work at looking at what they're communicating. So they did a study with the Carbon Trust where they provided people with a personal carbon allowance, and then they worked with them to understand how consumers are interested in reducing their footprint. Another one is BT. one of the key takeaways from them is that, as you'd expect, they're becoming a lot more technology focused. They're using interactive media for their reporting. They're very active on Twitter, and they're doing some quite interesting alternative work. So they were involved in a carbon footprinting gallery last year that was basically encouraging a new type of audience to come and find out about the work that they're doing around carbon footprinting. Okay, so I'm just going to leave you with this thought. Really, for carbon footprinting, we know that this regulation is coming in, but we also know that lots of companies are using it as a competitive advantage. They're moving away from just scope 1 and 2 footprinting, looking through the supply chain. And looking at the impact of their customers as well. This is a movement that is happening, and companies that don't adjust and don't prepare for it are going to be left behind, really. It's just some funny examples here of events in the past where people have not quite expected what's happened.
Well, thank you very much for that. Listed, but we're still going to look at reporting environment. So, Barbara, helping the group level, we've got some joint ventures. So you mentioned about control arrangements. How would we do something in terms of proportioning of emissions to the share of the business and stuff like that? Any ideas around that? So
it's at a group level. If you're required to report under the okay, if it's voluntary that you're doing, then it's up to you how you do so. And if you look at the different guidance notes, so they're quite similar, to be honest, GHG protocol and DEFRA guidance. It gives quite a lot of information about how you define your organisational boundary. So the different ways you look at operational and financial control, for example. But with the way the legislation's worded at the moment, it does look like you'd have to follow the financial control. So if you're reporting for your joint ventures, depending on the proportion of ownership, then you'd have to do the same for the carbon emissions. If you don't have operational control over those joint ventures and you're able to choose the operational control approach, then you wouldn't report at all. I think it has to be clear when you report the approach that you've taken. This is very much about transparency, not just about the number and what you're doing about it, but how you've actually arrived at that. Just because the regulation is so loose around the requirements.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think there was a hand at the back there, you said.
Yeah, I think it's allowed companies to have that flexibility because many are already reporting, and so they already have in place the systems and processes and a way of working, a way of measuring their own performance, and rather than introducing something new. And as I showed, there's already a lot of regulations on companies around carbon. I think the government has tried to mitigate any negative impact. They do recognise that there's a resource cost associated with reporting, and so they've kept it flexible. It will be really interesting to see what comes out of the consultation on the draft regulation, how many organisations or individuals have asked for greater clarity around the way in which companies have to report. But we have to watch this space.
So, 2 more questions at least. We'll take this one in the corner over there.
I think the regulations from memory are silent on mention of sanctions from the state. But presumably we need the Companies Act director's report framework. What does that say about the sanctions?
So there are no, as you rightly say, there's no sanctions on this, but companies are going to be pressured to report, I think, by their peers and other stakeholders. But it is a civil liability. So if the numbers are wrong or they cause issues for the company, then ultimately action could be brought against the directors by the company. So I think it's unlikely that would happen, but it's definitely an area of concern for boards at the moment about making sure that they're complying, and we're getting a lot of queries into the Carbon Trust for people asking for help around how they actually go about approaching this, because they don't want to get it wrong. I think there's a big reputational impact if a company is required to report. There are also other aspects within the directors' reports that companies have to report, and so it will fall under the same penalties as that.
Okay, one last question then, lady here on the right.
Under these new regulations, is that acceptable to
I think the way most companies are going to report is using different set of emission factors. So if you look, for example, at DEFRA's guidance on conversion factors, they provide a separate number for each of the three gases within there, and then a carbon equivalent. So to some extent, it's a simple matter of using a different conversion factor. And for many of the companies that fall within the companies that are affected by this regulation, that will be what they do. There are some other companies that I think if you're already a heavy industry and you'd already be captured by something like the EU ETS, you'd already have quite a good handle on emissions. Another area is emissions from air conditioning and refrigeration, which is part of the basket of the Kyoto gases. And I think for many organisations that's going to be quite a very small immaterial part of their footprint. There is an opportunity for companies to talk about materiality. It's not defined within the regulation around what materiality means, but there's the comply or explain clause, so companies would be able to say, we haven't included emissions from air conditioning system, or we haven't included a particular set of emissions because it doesn't form a large proportion of our footprint.
Louisa, thank you so much.